The fact of the matter is the extraterrestrial presence has been saving our bacon for about 80 years, preventing nuclear war and even space objects from striking the Earth. But we have a group of people who have technologies that are targeting those ET objects who are imperiling the whole planet. I'm going to tell the truth and the whole truth and nothing but the truth. But that gets you banned. Most people don't want to know how dangerous this whole issue is. And I get cut off a lot, even by people in the Congress. They said, we don't want to hear any more about that. But the fact of the matter is, the extraterrestrial presence has been saving our bacon for about 80 years, preventing nuclear war and even space objects from striking the Earth. But we have a group of people who have technologies that are targeting those objects, the ET objects, who are imperiling the whole planet. So it's a very complicated, nuanced problem, and it's the opposite of how it's portrayed in the media and in the corporate media and in the internet search algorithms from Google and elsewhere. So I think it's a very big issue, and the people who are on the inside, let's just say the people who are operational now today in these black projects that are being run illegally, but these are guys who got pulled in, maybe they were 18, 20, Green Berets, Special Forces, Delta Force guys. They now realize that they're in a system that is completely corrupt, and they're wanting to have themselves liberated from it. I had a very poignant story. Last year, I was being driven around in the Southern California area in an armored vehicle. It looked like a Denali, but it's armored. And, the guy who dropped me off at my place, he was in that system, and he said, "Thank you for what you're doing for those of us stuck on the other side." And he was referring to he and all his brothers who were in these programs, who some of them been there 30 years now, right? 25, 30 years. And they know now that it's a completely dangerous and corrupt, illegal operation, but they're in it. So, how do you build the bridge to liberate these guys? And with it, the technologies that would save the biosphere, right? So that's, although, I want to talk about this in the Middle East, but we haven't needed oil for decades. So, all that's going to go the way of all flesh. It's a huge change coming, and it's got to come very quickly now, given the state of the world. I can't speak to the ones that I'd have to know about whom you're speaking, okay? The people who say that, if you look at the hearings last year in Congress that were just these brief events, people like Mr. Brush and others, they don't understand that they can talk about anything related to this subject because the subject has been declared an unconstitutional operation. A priori, there are no non-disclosure agreements or national security oaths that pertain to it. That's the legal foundation of the whole disclosure project, which I actually started in 1993 when I was asked to brief the director of the CIA. It was called Operation Starlight at that time, and it was private. I'm a trauma doctor, and I was flown up from North Carolina to brief Mr. Clinton's CIA director, and within a few months of him being elected or sworn in. And so what we decided was once we could absolutely prove that the key people in our government here, as well as United Kingdom and some other countries, Canada, were being lied to or denied access or even threatened for looking into it, at that point, we and our constitutional team of lawyers said these are illegal projects. A priori, you can't enforce the National Security Act on it because you can't enforce the law around an operation that's by definition illegal, not being overseen properly by either the president or the Congress. So at that point, we have told every witness of ours, now the whistleblowers I have understand this, that they can talk about anything. What they filter on, this is important distinction, is information that isn't related specifically to this issue, that may be associated, that is still top secret, and that would be covered under a non-disclosure agreement. So this gets in the devil's in the details, as always, which people find boring, but I think it's important for people to understand this. The other part of it is that fear. So some people, even on my team, they will talk about a certain amount of information, and then they'll self-censor, not because they can't talk about it, but because they're sort of programmed not to, and they're afraid of consequences for them or their family. So in terms of retribution, the other self-censoring thing, and I'm dealing with this a lot with Congress, the senior folks who are like right hand to the Senate Intelligence Committee and people like that, they can only tell their bosses, meaning the chair and co-chairs of these kind of committees, so much before they kind of lose them. One of the problems is it's a little bit like what is that movie, A Few Good Men, when Jack Nicholson, he's asked, Tom Cruise says, I just want to know the truth. He goes, you can't handle the truth, and goes screams at him like that. It's a little bit like that because, if you tell some of these guys who are just, they're basically, still have training wheels on learning about this issue, and these are senior members of the United States Senate and House, you tell them too much, they just shut down or they become afraid. So, we have to be understanding the human limitations of understanding this. And part of my job is to keep pushing that envelope without breaking it. It's hard because I'm holding information and intelligence on this that goes back 34 years now that I've been gathering, 762 whistleblowers that I've debriefed with all their information. So how much do you say to whom? And I know that this sort of self-censoring happens with these witnesses. Like, I know that Mr. Brush was asked about, have people been killed? The congressman that asked that question, I had previously briefed and assured him I know people who have been. And Grush says, well, I can't talk about that. We have to be in a SCIF, which is a secure compartmented information facility where top secret information. That's not true. He could have talked about it, and he should have. But he's getting some very bad advice by some attorneys right now, and who don't understand the bigger picture. I mean, you really have to go back and unpack this for a long time. But you also have to have what I call inverse witnesses. Inverse witnesses are the ones who should know about this, who don't. They're more important than the ones who know about it, because that's how you prove the operation's illegal. I mean, if you're the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency or CIA or the president or chairs of these key committees, and you're not told anything or you're threatened when you inquire, that is proof that the operation is illegal. And that then liberates everyone who wants to talk about this. But you have to have that, fund of knowledge and the proof. And I have it in my archive. Here are the meetings that I have. This person was denied access. Everyone in the world now knows that Admiral Wilson, who is head of Intelligence Joint Staff, we briefed at the Pentagon, and then he was threatened and was shut down, notwithstanding his high position to be the main source of intelligence for the whole Joint Chiefs of Staff, right? I mean, and he was told, you don't have a need to know. And this is the guy in charge of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So when you can prove this, then you make this conclusion. If you don't know what I just said, you're still wondering, what the landscape is here. So I think for that reason, a lot of those whistleblowers censor themselves because they are still drinking the false narrative and the Kool-Aid of their training under national security provisions and what are called OPSECs, Operation Security. Here's what you can say, here's what you can't. But you have to understand this deeper context to be able to then realize what you can and cannot say. Well, I mean, I think the secrecy on this probably goes back to the early 20th century. It's funny, when Mr. Trump was president, I put in his briefing document, the very first image was a dissection of ET on a slab with some intel and military people there with some doctors from 1922 to 28 is when it's been dated. And we got this from a very interesting series of events. So I believe that there has been some degree of classification on this going back to the late 1800s, early 1900s. But the big action started, obviously, once we detonated the first atomic bomb and the ETs realized that we were an existential threat to life on Earth as well as potentially to them. That's when the modern era started. The whole thing went off the rails in terms of supervision in about 1956 to 60, when Eisenhower was shoved aside. So President Eisenhower, the reason he gave that famous speech when he left office, in large part was this issue, although he didn't acknowledge it. He said, beware the military-industrial complex. And a lot of people were going, well, this is a two-term Republican president who had 5 stars back then. And hero. Why would he be saying this about the military-industrial complex when his whole career has been military, right? Is because he saw the power that the corporate end of this, let's call it the fascistic corporate moneyed interest, did to take over the interests of the people and the United States government, where he was being pushed aside and he was being denied access. And if you don't take my word for this, we have a witness who was Army communications specialist, or Army Signal Corps used to be called in the White House, who knew Eisenhower. And Eisenhower directly told him this is what had happened to him. And this was in 59 and 60. So we know that somewhere between the mid 50s and 60, Eisenhower lost control of these programs. They went deep black, illegal, and they have never been under proper supervision since. So you can track it. I've been able to track it all the way back almost, 65 to 70 years. Yeah. You don't go through interstellar space and can't navigate an electrical storm in Roswell, New Mexico. My friends that are pilots can navigate an electrical storm in New Mexico in a F-18 or Airbus 321. They were downed. These objects were downed. They were ET craft that were struck with a type of electromagnetic weapon, early one in the mid to late 40s, and they were developed based on the work that Tesla had done on scalar electromagnetic systems and what they learned about EMPs, electromagnetic pulses that go out when you detonate an atomic bomb. Those got weaponized. The early ones were not very accurate, but they were good enough to hit the ones that downed in New Mexico in the 40s. They've since become extraordinarily advanced. I mean, we're talking dozens of generations of refinement, so much so they can be portable the size of this computer and be put on a vehicle and strike an object at a distance. So they're illegal. I mean, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty clearly forbids electromagnetic pulse weapons because of how dangerous they are, and they're a component of the nuclear blast. But it's basically you're taking out, without the nuclear blast, you're taking out that EMP aspect and then weaponizing it. That's what's happened. And that's how they're targeting the ET craft and downing them. So they don't just accidentally crash. Now, I don't know of any that have been crashed because of a malfunction. I think they've come down because we're targeting them. And I think at this point, it's well over 1,000 of them, probably 2,000. I had a naval intelligence guy approach me once back in the probably mid-90s, and I was given some presentation. He pulled me aside and he says he had been present when we used those weapons and targeted these objects. And by the way, our archive that we released has 122 of these downed cases, many of them with direct witness testimony. And that's in the archive for anyone who's listening to see. It's at the Disclosure Project Intelligence Archive, dpiarchive.com. But what I learned from this was that they not only wanted to get the technology and reverse engineer and study it, they didn't want the ETs to be known too much by the public until they could control it and control the narrative attached to it. And then thirdly, the ETs explicitly wanted us to disarm and stop using those weapons because their guidance systems and their propulsion systems, their physics, are disrupted when an EMP goes out that has a scalar component. Now, what most people don't know, and we have a GE physicist on our team, I think he has 6 PhDs, and his specialty is this area. And he works for General Electric. And he knows that when you have an EMP embedded in it, it's called a scalar signal, which goes faster than the speed of light, right? It's because of scalar signal. A normal electromagnetic wave or pulse is still a waveform like this, right? Propagating through the vacuum at 186,000 miles per second. A scalar is, they call it longitudinal sometimes, is a point, the energy that goes out in a straight line. And there you have a problem because now you're going beyond the speed of light and you're crossing into the area of communications and physics dealing with extraterrestrial vehicles systems. And that's another reason. So they wanted us to stop using those weapons. Our military guys say, like the hell we are. We're going to be in a nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union. And so it's gone. All right. So now we have 70, 80 years of this madness. So that was the other issue, is that the ETs absolutely wanted us to stop using those. And if you look at the case files we have, there is a preponderance of these ET objects surveilling and going over all our nuclear facilities, not just nuclear bombs, but nuclear processing facilities, even nuclear energy facilities, because they know how dangerous it is. And they know that whole civilizations have vanished on other planets, frankly, because of these. And so that is a prevailing interest on their part. So again, I know you're going to ask a question. I'm going to kind of unpack it a little more complicated, but because there's a very deep story here, but there's also a deep science behind it. So why were they, obviously these civilizations, in my opinion, have been observing this planet for millennia. Why was this huge modern era opened up where there have been so many millions of sightings and events? It's because of our development of these weapons of mass destruction, where we're now a threat to all life on Earth, but potentially going out into space. And this is the other problem. The 50s coincided with our early development of our space program. Sputnik was in 57 when the Soviets, then we had the Apollo mission that my uncle worked on. My uncle helped design the lunar module that landed on the moon with Neil Armstrong. So what you realize is that, put these two things together and look through the eyes of the ETs. We're a bunch of rampaging monkeys blowing each other up, right? We've had all these world wars. The fighting goes on to this day. Now we have weapons that can destroy a whole world, but now we're trying to go out into space where we could be a threat to them, right? And their planets. Mm-hmm. Because remember, if you're dealing with something beyond the speed of light and you develop it well enough, you could target a distant planet out of our solar system and potentially strike it without going there with these kind of weapons. Now, this is something I don't talk about much, but I can tell you that these extraterrestrial civilizations, plural, there are dozens of them, none of them are hostile, but boy, are they concerned about our hostility, because here's the problem. Our technology has exceeded our social and spiritual development. I mean, that's a problem. This is how a civilization goes poof, because we're still very primitive socially. We're still each other. Our civilization is built on greed and avarice and control and domination and destruction and war, most of it. And until we get over that hump, which is the biggest challenge, I think, is a social and spiritual crisis, not religious, spiritual, which I make a distinction on that. I think there's an inverse relationship usually between religiosity and spirituality. But I think that this is the truth, is that these civilizations from other star systems are observing this, but they're sort of appalled. And the longer these sort of covert programs develop these technologies, the other problem I find with this whole subject is everyone's always fighting the last war, as they say. They're looking in the rearview mirror. And they don't look at right now or looking forward, because right now is not 1947. Right now is not 1977. I mean, the technological curve, when you have trillions of dollars, and I'm not kidding, trillions of dollars that have gone into covert engineering and research and development at my uncle's old company, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed, Raytheon, E-Systems, EG&G, all these big SAIC, Booz Allen Hamilton. What happens is that in those compartmented super secret operations, they recruit the smartest, most amazing physicists and engineers and brains possible. And they're paid well, and they're protected. And your brilliant people are not at Harvard and MIT. I hate to tell people, they're in these programs because they're picked out of high school or early in college and they're pulled in. And with that kind of brain power, and you have in your possession the materiel, the extraterrestrial vehicles and devices and systems, they're going to be big breakthroughs. And now we have 80 years almost of that kind of big breakthrough research and development. And it doesn't stand still. Anyone who knows technological developments, look at our own internet and things, it starts out kind of like this, and then it goes nonlinear. It goes boom, right? So that's the problem. But it's a development technologically with no one minding the store from the people or never mind the press, which is utterly corrupt, or the government. And mainly it's because the people in the United States government, 99.9 whatever percent don't know anything about this. And that's on purpose. So everyone thinks, everyone asks me, why is the government hiding this? I said, which government? Whose government? The government that we elect and appoint? They don't know anything for the most part. A few do. And those are corrupt interests that we know who they are, and they're being handed over to a law enforcement team, frankly, even as we speak this week. Covert, illegal government interest operations and corporate. So think of a hybridized entity. But I think the center of power is clearly not in the constitutional elected officials and appointed officials. I think if you were to have a frank conversation with any president, they won't admit this. No one wants to admit they're the emperor that has no clothes, right? But if you were to have a frank conversation, they go, same thing with these senior senators and members of Congress I've met with. They should know, they don't know, and they're not lying. They're not covering it up. Now, there are a few members of the Congress who are read into this and who are problematic and who, for example, were instrumental in the Senate bill last year that came out that would have given amnesty and protection to whistleblowers coming forward. And that was all neutralized by the House reconciliation between the Senate. And we know who those devils were who did that. And we run them through the system, and we know who's paying for them, where are they getting their money, and who has them in their pocket. So the fact that they are colluding with a corrupt enterprise and committing treason against the United States government means that they could be tried for treason. I'm saying this bluntly. So this is serious stuff. And, I think the people who now come forward beyond the whistleblowers and the defectors are the people who are in the government with enough authority to do something about this, who are now authorizing, extending immunity to people. And this is outside the Congress. This is people in, I can't say what agencies or whatever, but who now realize that there's an enormous problem that's an existential threat to the world. And so they're devoted to getting this resolved. And these are people who, they're not afraid of taking a bullet. I mean, these are guys who've been on frontline special forces, guys, and I know them very well, and they're serious. And that's why I'm very encouraged. I know it sounds scary to the public, maybe listening, but I'm actually very encouraged that there's a band of guys and operational programs that are legal, that are operating to get all of this under control as soon as they can. It's complicated. You're the head of, I don't say where, you're special operations wherever, and you have jets, and you have helicopters, and you have guns, and you have tanks, and you have whatever. Right? The people who you're needing to put in check have technologies that are thousands of years more advanced based on studying extraterrestrial vehicles. And so they have portable EMP and scalar weapons that can make your helicopters and jets fall right out of the sky or freeze your entire group of armed vehicles. So one of the things I've been asked to do by these guys who are trying to move forward is because they can't be identified publicly. I'm already out in the public, so I'm exposed. Is to say to guys and let it get back channeled to anyone watching your show or David or whoever's, Sean Ryan's show, whoever it is, that here's what we're going to do if law enforcement and a legally constituted entity shows up at your facility. Put your weapon down. And if you don't, you're colluding with an illegal treasonous operation, and you could therefore be arrested but also prosecuted for treason. So that message we're being very clear about, so that what we're hoping happens when this group stands up and rolls or moves, that there won't be any resistance. It'd be like the Orange Revolutions in Eastern Europe and stuff, where it just happened without any kinetic, violent sequela or outcomes. So that's what we're aiming for, is a peaceful transfer of these operations back under constitutional control, and then a careful release of select technologies, particularly energy generation technologies, that would completely save the biosphere and in 20 years, would end all poverty on the planet. I mean, we have these technologies. the former chairman of a Fortune 50 corporation who is trying to defect, but he's had his whole family threatened because he's waiting to see which sacrificial lambs get taken out. He doesn't want to be that one, right? He's waiting to see if the security programs that are being put in place are adequate. So I'm sort of the canary in the mine shaft. There's some other canaries in the mine shaft. But look, I mean, it's all about what risk you're willing to take. And I can tell you this man was approached right after he reached out to us and was told they will you and all your grandchildren and children, very bluntly. And by the way, there's a head of state in Europe I've learned about recently had the same thing happen. So this is serious stuff. And, you know, the question is how much those guys trust that the protective capabilities of this special access project is really able to protect them, right? And their whole extended family. And this is a complicated problem because you're dealing with thugs. I've been dealing with these thugs since the early 90s, you know, but we understand how they operate and what their mindset is. And when I say thugs, you know, it's funny, when I first, about 3 years ago, the senior guy, Senate Intelligence Committee, who was tasked with looking into this on behalf of the chair and co-chair of the committee, when I met with him the first time in the SCIF for the Senate, he said to me, well, why don't people just come forward? And I explained about this thuggery. And he said, really? I said, oh, yeah. And then we leave the SCIF. He goes out to his home in suburban Virginia, and they deploy 2 unmarked helicopters over his house, staring down at him with his 4 children in the house with the whole house shaking. And he says, wow, these are thugs. I said, yes, sir. I told you they're thugs. So that is a true story. So, I mean, imagine this is a guy who knows nothing, who's just trying to inquire about this on behalf of one of the key oversight committees in the whole United States government. And this happens to him right away. And to this day, he continues to be harassed. So in all kinds of ways, there are all kinds of ways you can harass people legally, false investigations. Suddenly there's an IRS audit, right? You know, people who think that these agencies don't have people in them that will abuse their authority and power, you know, are, you know, delusional. It happens all the time. It's not political per se. It's who has an agenda and who can pull those strings, right? Who has those guys as their puppets. And that's what happens. So, you know, I've had those games run on me since the early 90s. And you know, it takes some kind of, you know, determination and courage to move forward. Luckily, that guy I'm referring to, who I cannot name, he had been a special operator, military, and then became the senior guy for Senate Intel. So when I met with him, he'd be the equivalent of a 3-star general if he'd stayed military. And so he'd seen action, and he'd gone mano a mano in bad situations in the Middle East, Africa. And so, you know, he was not he wasn't some, you know, penny loafer wearing lawyer from Yale. You know, he was, no offense to penny loafer wearing lawyers from Yale, but be careful. I have a daughter who's Stanford Law School, but but you know, the thing is that that's really what it boils down to. I'll be honest with you, is, you know, you have to have the information and knowledge about this, but you also then have to have the integrity not to be corrupted. But you have to have the courage to act. If you don't have the courage to act, the rest of it doesn't matter.